Okay, thank you so much for having me today in the Junior Migration Seminar. I think the program ahead is really exciting, so to all the attendees, don't miss the next presentations. So this is a joint work with Sam Bazzi from Boston University and Hillel Rapoport from the Paris School of Economics, and it's really work in progress, so don't hesitate to throw all your questions and comments. So the motivation for this paper is sort of the fertility transition, right? This rapid fall in children mortality rates, on the other hand, also a decrease in fertility rates that has been ubiquitous in all countries of the world. Now, the thing is that the timing for this demographic transition has been quite different. So it's argued that it started in France in the 18th century or even earlier, but most developing countries actually experienced this fertility transition, this demographic transition only in the 20th century. So there has been a lot of work trying to discuss what are the causes of the fertility transition, actually the timing of the fertility transition, and there are plenty of different hypotheses and proposals, such as the influence of religion, particularly in France, and in concrete, the fall, the decline in religiosity, also the potential role of education place, and more recently, other factors such as the potential role of migrants diffusing information, for instance. However, as of today, we know very little actually about these potential mechanisms of how migration and being exposed to other people can actually influence fertility decisions and how people can actually diffuse their culture, diffuse their fertility norms and have an impact on the fertility transition. So what we are trying to do in this paper is study how migrants and natives interact and how their fertility norms can influence each other. Ultimately, we want to understand what are the determinants of cultural diffusion and the potential backlash among different groups. So to answer these questions, we are relying on a unique setting, which is Indonesia, because in the 1980s, there was a huge national policy relocating several million people from the islands of Java and Bali to other islands in the country. So there was a random assignment of people to these new settlements, and they gathered together these transmigrants from Java and Bali, and people who were actually living in other villages nearby, so locals. We will be using exhaustive data from the population censuses, so the full count of population of 2000 and 2010, and this will be the main data sources that we will exploit, where we will be focusing on the fertility outcomes, so the number of children that we may have. And to have other measures before the transmigration program took place, we will use the censuses of the 1971 and 1980, and with this we will construct our measures of fertility norms, right? The common pattern of fertility decisions of people coming from different places. So due to this unique natural experiment that took place in Indonesia, the empirical approach will be very easily, because I will show you that the allocation of migrants to places was quasi-random. So it was completely unrelated to the norms, the fertility norms that they will face at destination. So this mix, this composition mix between people from different ethnic groups who hold different fertility norms and natives will make random exposure to different levels of fertility norms. And I will explain, I will be very, very clear about what I mean when I say fertility norms and exposure in the future. So the main results of the paper is that natives, the people who were living in these islands, are actually influenced by the newcomers, by the transmigrants, and they convert towards the fertility norms that they observe. So say that, for instance, a group of transmigrants come from lower fertility norms, right? The natives exposed to them to reduce the number of children they have. On the other hand, actually, transmigrants are influenced by natives and other transmigrants, but sort of backlash. They try to differentiate themselves from the fertility norms of the groups that are surrounding them. So say that they are exposed to other transmigrants with higher fertility norms, so they will tend to have fewer children, or if they are exposed to natives, again, with a higher fertility norms, that will make them also try to decrease their fertility. The roadmap for today is very straightforward. I'll give you some background about this policy and how it works. Then I will present you the data, we construct the measures, what is the design in an essence for the analysis, and we'll go through several tables of results. So the transmigration program was a huge scale natural experiment, national policy that relocated around 2 million people, Java and Bali, to the outer islands of the country. And this took place mostly between 1979 and 1989, so in 1 decade. The main objective of this policy was to alleviate the population pressure that there was in these 2 islands, and also to repopulate these outer islands that have very low population density. But indirectly, there are also accounts that suggest that one of the objectives of this policy was to foster national identity, so a common sense of Indonesian identity, and to increase the food production of the country. So the way this works is that new villages, new rural villages were created from scratch, out of nothing. So they clear sites, they clear like huge spaces, and they prepared farming lots, they constructed the houses, they connected these villages to the road network. So they did like these massive investments to create these new villages out of nothing. Then the way the allocation worked was sort of random. So they created plots of 2 hectares. When everybody arrived, when all the new settlers arrived, by a lottery system, they assigned these plots to people. So everybody sort of had like basics, provisions to farm for the first years. And there was no way one could actually choose to decide, I want to live here or there, or I want to work this particular land. So this all was done in a random and administrative way. So this is the location of the villages, transmigration villages, in which we will be focusing. And just to fix ideas, transmigrants will be population, will be people who were born in Java and Bali, in the inner islands that you can see in the south. And what I will call natives will be people who were actually born in the outer islands, so in these regions outside Java and Bali. A bit more details about the program. So the program targeted families, and this would need to be a married couple with or without children, but with the special condition of the household head being between 20 and 40. If they have older relatives within the household unit, they could also carry them with themselves, say like grandpa or grandma. The typical profile of these transmigrants, of these Balian and Javalian people who emigrated, were those of landless agricultural workers from a poor background without lots of savings and also little education, right? So we are talking about a negatively selected group. But just to be very clear, for the analysis that we will be doing, it doesn't really, we will not exploit the fact that these people are different from the people who remain in Java and Bali. So what we will be exploiting is that among all these transmigrants, we will have some people going to different places, and these people will come from ethnic groups that have different fertility norms. Something very important is that in these new villages, they establish some quotas. And these quotas were reserved for local people who were living, so for the natives who were living in neighboring villages. So depending on the village, between 10 and 30% of the land and the new houses was kept for natives, for local people to join these new transmigration villages. So there was a mix between newcomers, transmigrants coming from Java and Bali, and also what I call natives, that are people who were already in the island, in neighboring villages or neighboring regions, who decided to opt for this opportunity to access land and land and a house. So again, very importantly, transmigrants have no control at all over the destination that they would have upon enrolling on this program. And they knew very little, even once they had signed and they knew that they would be going to this place, they knew almost nothing about these other islands or the conditions they would face. Now, what determined that some people went to some villages or others? Well, what we know from the reports that were written at the time, the discussions of policymakers at the time, is that the constraints, the administrative constraints that they face in order to, clear the sites and prepare everything and send the people, were the main determinant of who will be going where. So when you would enroll before departing, you would wait in some camps in Java and Bali. They had several camps in the islands, and once the site was finished, then they would embark everybody and bring them to the new village, and they would also bring the new locals. So they would create this new population. Almost most of the people arrive set villages in the first year. So just to be clear, so this is the share of people who were arriving to the outer islands by year. It's not the case that they would open a village and then time after time it would be filled by people, but no. What is happening is that new villages are being created over time, right? But by the time they open, all the land and all the houses are allocated. So in less than 5 years, we have like more than half of all transmigrants arriving to the new settlements. And then in the last years of the 1980s, we have like around 5% of either locals or transmigrants every year. This graph here shows you the share of transmigrants, of people coming from Java and Bali in these new settlements, and overall is quite bad. So they try to, on average, have half and half, even if I told you before that they had these quotas of only between 10 and 30%, the reality was that policymakers, local officials, manipulated these quotas and they tried to bring more local. So there is a lot of heterogeneity in the share of transmigrants in these new villages. It goes like from very little to almost 80%, but on average, they are 50-50. What about fertility norms? What about the fertility patterns of this population? So transmigrants, people from Java and Bali, on average, in the 1970s, they used to have fewer kids per woman. So on average, like 3.5 children per adult women. While in the outer islands, in the rest of the islands, the norm, 1970s, will be above 4 children per adult women. So these transmigrants were actually carrying with themselves a fertility pattern, a fertility norm of having like fewer than the natives to which they will be exposed, okay? And this is already like a sort of like a preview of what I mean by fertility norms. Is simply what are the fertility patterns, the common rule among people from your own background, right? From your ethnic group, from your own birthplace. So what is the data that we have and how do we measure fertility norms? So the main analysis, all the tables that I will show you, all the regressions are rely on contemporary census data from the 2000 and 2010. So these population censuses have obviously the number of children that every woman has had, all the children ever born, and all kinds of information such as schooling, occupations, religion, and importantly, the district of birth of that person. And that will be essential to the who is a transmigrant born in Javan Valley, in a district in Javan Valley, and who is a native, somebody who was born in one of the other regions. What is the sample that we will be using? Well, we'll focus on all the women who were younger than 30 at the time they arrived to this new transmigrant village. So today they are roughly between 20 and 60 years old, right? So we will be focusing on these transmigration villages and all women who would be subject to react to this new exposure, to this new name, so to speak. So the outcome, we will be focusing all the time on the children ever born of these women. Now, to construct the measures of fertility norms, we rely on historical censuses, on previous censuses, in concrete, more precisely, the 1971 and 1980 census. And again, this is the full count population census. We have the whole population here, so we can have the number of children that every woman has in every district, right? So the way we go about this is that we simply take the average number of children per adult women between the age of 30 and 60, and we call this the fertility norm. So we measured this in the 1970s, 1971 and 1980 in all the regions, and then we will assign to individuals this average number of children, this fertility norm, on the basis on the place where they were born. So we will have different measures of norms. So we will have your individual norm, that is to say, the average fertility pattern in the district in which you were born. Then we will have the norm at your destination, which is the average pattern of fertility in the 1970s, in the district where you currently live today. And then the norm of transmigrants, the average norm of all these transmigrants, right? So we will just do a weighted average of all these people. So let me give you like a simple illustration to clear everything up. So imagine that there is a new transmigration village that is created, right? So in this case, in this example, it has two names, right? One is local, meaning that that person was born in that particular district. And another one is still a native, but I call mover because maybe he came from a region nearby. But he is not a transmigrant because she was not born in Javan Valley. And in these particular examples, we have 3 transmigrants, 3 people, 3 women coming from Javan Valley. In each of their places of origin, in each of their districts of origin. So for instance, this green woman, she's coming from a district where in the 70s, all women were having 2 children on average, all right? The women in orange is coming from a district in Javan Valley where women tended to have in the 70s 3 children on average. The blue woman comes from a district in Java where women used to have very few children, only 1, right? So in this new transmigrant village, the average norm of transmigrants will be 2 children, all right? The average norm of natives, right? The average norm at destination, right, will be the number of children that in this particular district, right, was the rule in the 1970s, which was 5, right? So here we have like 3 new women coming from Javan Valley to this new village and 2 locals, right? So we will be exploiting the differences in the intensity, how many transmigrants are coming, and what is their origin, why they are coming, and what were the common norms in terms of fertility at the time. Now, in this setting, in this design, there are 2 features that are crucial. The first one is that transmigrants were actually randomly allocated to these villages. So it's not the case that perhaps, for instance, people with very low fertility, coming from places with very low fertility norms, were allocated to places where they would interact with natives who would have also very few children or a low fertility, or the other way around, right? So I'm gonna show you now in a second that there was no relationship at all between the norms of the transmigrants that arrived to a place and what was the norm in that particular area. Something else that is important is that the size of the transmigrant population in a given transmigrant village is also orthogonal to the fertility norms in that place. So here in this graph, I'm showing you the first claim. So in the vertical axis, in the horizontal axis, you have the average number of children born per adult women in the 1970s in one of these districts in the outer islands. And in the vertical axis, you have the average fertility norm of the transmigrants going to that particular place on the basis of what was the fertility in the 1970s in their origins. And as you can see, there is no relation at all. That means that there is no association, there is no relationship between what is the fertility norm, fertility pattern of a group of transmigrants and the fertility pattern to which they will be exposed later on. This is the second claim that I just told you. Here, again, on the horizontal axis, now you have the average fertility norm in the destination, right? In the place where the migrants will go. And on the vertical axis, you have the share of transmigrants in that place. So there was not a systematic pattern in the sense that they tended to send few people or a lot of people to places that had natives with very low or very high numbers of children per woman. And this is again a similar pattern. Now, instead of relying on the number of children per woman, we have the share of contraceptive use, both in the origin and the destination, and there is no relationship at all between the knowledge or use of contraceptives by people who were sent to a particular place and the knowledge and use in that particular area. So this is the main estimation question that we will do over and over, right? So we will be looking at the number of children born by women, right? So don't get mad with all these subscripts because there's a lot going on, but I'm gonna explain like step by step. So we will have women, right, living in a village B, in a given district D, in one of the islands G, and then we will have people coming from different origin districts that we will call O. So the origin districts can either be in Java and Bali or in the outer islands. Now, the outcome variable is the number of children ever born by the adult women. And in the regression, we will be having island fixed effects and 3 measures of norms, as I described previously. We will have the individual norm, so the common fertility pattern in my district of origin, my birth district in the 1970s. The average fertility norm for transmigrants, again, always measured using data from the 1970s. And finally, the destination norm. So the average number of children born per woman in the current district, but measured in the 1970s. So if you are a native, if you are somebody who lives in this village and who never moved, actually your destination norm and your origin norm will be the same, right? So you are living in the place where you were born, in the place where you are currently living. But for all the rest, for transmigrants, the destination norm is the number of children born per woman in the 1970s in the place where they are currently residing. And then we will have 3 sets of controls. So we will have individual variables, just the age of the person, their level of education, the religion. We will have socioeconomic and geographical controls measured in the 1970s in the origin of transmigrants, and we will have, again, these same measures, but observed in the current village in the 1970s. Okay, so let me just go directly to the results. So here I'm showing you the impact of the 3 different norms on the number of children ever born by native women in the 2000s. As you can see, this is, you could have imagined there is a positive relationship between your norm and how many children you have, right? So how many children people in this place used to have in the 1970s is positively associated with how many children you're going to have today. Now, the interesting thing is that the norm, the average norm among migrants has a positive effect on these natives. This means that if you happen to be exposed to a group of transmigrants who carry with themselves higher fertility norms, you will tend to have a slightly higher number of children than otherwise, right? So depending on the norms that the transmigrants are carrying with themselves, natives will try to have slightly more or slightly fewer children. What is going on with transmigrants? So transmigrants, again, they are influenced by the fertility patterns of the place where they originally come from, right? So their individual norm, again, one additional children, say, in their district of birth is associated to 0.3, 0.4 more children on average by those women. Now, the interesting pattern is that there is a negative impact norm of the other transmigrants. So this average is always living outside your own ethnic group. This coefficient, actually what it means is that, for instance, if the norm of the other people surrounding you, the other transmigrant, is, for instance, 1 children more per woman higher on average, you will tend to decrease your number of children by 0.5, by half a children. Obviously, this makes no sense to have half a children less, but you get what I mean. And the same happens with respect to with the with exposure to natives. So if you look at among natives, so the lower, for instance, is the norm among natives, so these transmigrants will tend to increase their fertility. The higher it is the norm natives, these transmigrants will tend to decrease their fertility. This is the same, but estimated flexibly, so by age, instead of taking the sample altogether. And you can see that natives are reacting, particularly when they are when they arrive in the teenagehood or their early 20s. So individuals who arrive in their late 20s or 30s. So let me rephrase because so natives who arrived to this new village when they were 20-year-old, in their late 20s and so on, are not affected by transmigrants. So only young people, only young natives who arrived to the settlements were affected by the arrival of the newcomers. Concerning the transmigrants, the pattern is less consistent, so it's much less well precisely estimated, but it's sort of more or less the same. So we have like more or less people in the teenage years, so people, transmigrants who arrive in their teenagehood when they were like 15, 16, 17, are those who are backlashing, are those who are reacting in the opposite way. And now, as you could imagine, because people who already completed their fertility cycle should not be affected, so that's why you see all these imprecise estimates when we look at individuals age 30, 40, and so on. Now, how big?
Sorry to interrupt you, Martin. You have 10 minutes.
Yeah, very good. How big are these effects, right? So obviously, going from 1 children to 2 children is a huge increase. So how much do these norms vary? So the thing is, if we standardize everything, we get a sort of picture. It depends how one wants to read it, but overall, the impact of the norm of transmigrants is around 2% of standard deviation, right? So if we were to shift the average transmigrants norm by 1 standard deviation, natives would react by 2% of a standard deviation. So this is the equivalent of the 0.5 coefficient that I showed you before. But of course, like shifting the norm, say from 2 to 3 children on average, average is a very large increase. And the same is true for transmigrants, right? So on average, a shift, the effect of one standard deviation change in the average norm to which they are exposed leads to a 2.3% standard deviation change in the opposite direction in their fertility decisions. Next, we separate people by when they arrive to the settlements, because there are some people who actually have arrived very recently. So they didn't arrive in the first wave of settlement, but these villages have expanded over time, and there are some internal migrants who have joined, right? So we can have different groups of people, the natives who were born in that particular district, so locals. We can have the natives who were born elsewhere, but in those islands, so those is what we call movers. And then we can also distinguish among those who arrived recently, if they did so in 5 years ago or less, or more than 5 years ago. And what we see, for instance, is that those individuals, so both locals and native movers, react to the norm observed, to the norm of transmigrants. But those who react the most actually are the movers. And this, if you think that these migrants are self-selecting into these places, this sort of makes sense, right? So they may go to the places in which they may have a better fit with the fertility decisions of the people. If we focus on transmigrants in columns 5 and 6, what we observe is that only those who arrive at the beginning, so more than 5 years ago, react to the norm that they observe among other transmigrants, right? But both all transmigrants and those who have arrived very recently, they seem to backlash with respect to the norm they observe among natives at the destination. Almost to conclude, we split the sample between whether your norm is above or below that you observe among the other groups in your village. So for instance, here we have in column 1 natives whose norm is to have more children on average than transmigrants, and natives whose norm would be to have fewer children than transmigrants in column 2. And what we observe is that actually the positive influence, the association, the effect of transmigrants on these natives is very similar, regardless of whether individuals would tend to have fewer or more children than them. So this sort of influence, this sort of convergence, how transmigrants affect natives is independent of whether transmigrants come from places with high or lower fertility norms than the place they are going to. Now the story is different when we look at transmigrants. And here we are doing the same exercise. So in column 3 and 4, we are having transmigrants with a norm above that of the other transmigrants. And in column 4, individual transmigrants with a norm below that of other transmigrants, right? In this case, the backlash effect is only present for those individuals who have a very low fertility norm, right? So those who have a norm of having fewer children than the common among all transmigrants are the ones who are going to react in the opposite direction to what they see among the natives. Now, in column 5 and 6, we do the same, but instead of comparing to the norms of transmigrants, we compare to the norm of natives. So again, column 6 is telling you that the individuals who have, the transmigrants who have a fertility norm that is lower than that they will be exposed to at the destination are the ones who are experiencing the backlash effect. The final result, yes, the final result is, has to do with the influence of size of each group. So what we are doing is that we are using the share of individuals coming from the same district as you, right? And this is what we call the ethnic share or the transmigrant share. So if we focus, for instance, on column 3, we see that the size of natives in that particular village has no meaningful impact on the way transmigrants will affect your fertility decision. So whether you have a high or a low share of transmigrants in your population, the native group seems to be reacting anyway, converging towards those norms. The story is different when we look at transmigrants. So the backlash effect, this opposite movement of transmigrants in terms of fertility decisions is magnified by the size of their own ethnic group, of their own origin group, as you see in the last row. So the bigger is my group, the bigger is the share of people coming from the same district as me in this village, the more negatively I'm going to react to the norms that I observe among other transmigrants, but also among other natives. So to conclude, I show you today that transmigrants are influencing the fertility decisions of these natives. So this is causal evidence of diffusion of norms, diffusion of information about fertility norms. But transmigrants try to differentiate themselves and they react in complex ways, and particularly they experience a backlash effect, differentiation their fertility patterns from those to which they are exposed to other transmigrants and other natives. So the next steps that we are taking in this project is to examine the role that different potential channels may be playing in these results. So in particular, what is the influence of marriages between natives and transmigrants? Is that the reason why natives are sort of adjusting? Is because these women are marrying transmigrants who sort of impose their norms? What is the impact of having closer contacts or a more refined measure of exposure? So we want to go at a more detailed level, at the neighborhood level, right? Because now we've done everything at the individual level, but having measures that were constructed across districts. We will explore also the potential effect of conflict, how fractionalization and the polarization that rise between different groups could have influenced fertility decisions. And then we also want to look at the potential diffusion of information about family planning technologies, right? So the use of contraceptives. So that's all for today. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to your comments.
Okay, thanks a lot, Martin. I think we already have some questions. Some are coming from Elsa, and also we have a question from Simone. So Lucas, could you please unmute them?
Hi, do you hear me well?
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Martin, for this nice presentation. So it was really great to hear you and to hear this work. I have a concern about the selection between transmigrant and the native. So the transmigrants are coming from Java and Bali, and given the first figure you showing the number of children for transmigrants and native and the huge difference between the extreme, I'm concerned about the difference in the bargaining power of women coming from Java and Bali. And is it possible that they really differ in characteristic between the natives and the women who are part of a couple who is transmigrants? And do you know if it's possible for a woman to be a child of a transmigrant couple and to be considered as a native? Do you consider the child of transmigrants as natives? And so yes, we begin with those two questions. Thanks.
Yeah, so let me start backwards, right? So we only consider the sample people who who were born before arriving to these new sites,
Okay.
right? So that by using then the information of where they were born, we know for a fact whether they are coming from Javan Valley or whether they are coming from other parts of the outer islands, right? So then our measure of natives or transmigrants is not contaminated by the second generation, sort of what we could be like mixed between saying that they are natives or transmigrants. Now, regarding what you say about the bargaining power of women, that's something very interesting I'm actually, I have no clue what to tell you, right? So it's probably that women coming from Javan Valley, they have higher bargaining power because they have fewer children on average, but at the same time is influenced by so many other characteristics that are different between Javan Valley and the other islands that is difficult to tell, right? So these women at the same time, they are negatively selected from Javan Valley, right? So they tend to be poor, they are less educated. So I wouldn't know what to tell you regarding what is the influence of the bargaining power of these women, but it will be for sure very important to look at the role of intermarriages, right? So
Yeah,
if
sure.
Java and Bali women, they marry natives and they carry with themselves a sense of, if they are more empowered, if they manage to sort of influence more their decisions, then we would observe this pattern. So that's something interesting that we should explore or like discuss further. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm thinking about the household head, the couple eligible to resettlement. Are they all headed by male, or there are some female who head those households?
No, so all the households, so all the people who migrated, one condition is that it had to be a married couple. So you always have these dyads. You have a man and a woman in this case, right? So it's always like nuclear families with or without children. So if you were single, you could not be part of the transmigration program. I don't know if that answers the question.
But some couple could be headed by female before migration, and that's why I explain why those women have bargaining power higher, and then
yeah. So these women could be the household head, and maybe that's something that we could, so probably, so in the census, there is definitely a measure about who is the household head. I would bet that in most of the cases it's the men, but actually we can look at that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Hello, Martin. Do you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Simone.
Okay. Thanks for a great presentation. Unfortunately, I was online only after 10 minutes since the start, so I missed the introduction. I have one question that is probably related to your last slide. Thinking about whether you have thought about exploiting also the variance in transmigrants norms at origin, because you are computing the mean, but different destinations were exposed to larger or smaller variances. And my presumption is that if you interact the mean with the variance, a higher variance should lower the influence of the norm at origin on natives, because the norm in a sense was much more diverse and possibly less effective in shaping behavior. And I was wondering whether you have tried or you consider trying this kind of interaction.
So absolutely. So this is a very good point. This is something that we are considering doing now, because we realize that this weighted mean, so this mean of the norm of transmigrants is something quite good, right? And we sort of like, we want to dig deeper into what are the particular groups that are influencing each other. So maybe among all the transmigrants, there is a group which is very big, and that's the one who is actually having an influence on the others, right? So whether you have only one big transmigrant group, or whether you have like many different small groups, right? That will completely change the potential influence that transmigrants can have. So I think that your suggestion is completely great, and that we have to explore not only the mean, but also the variance and the diversity of these norms among the transmigrant population.
Okay, and then a small follow-up question. So apologies again, this time is my daughter who stepped in, so I might have missed some robustness. I was wondering whether you have also, I presume that there's a strong correlation between the number of children and the age at first birth. And I was wondering if you have information on the age at first birth, and if you have checked whether there's a transmission that is going on there.
Yeah, so we don't know the age of the unfortunately we don't know the age at which they had children, right?
Okay.
We only observe the children if they are living in the household, right? But if they left, we cannot impute when they first children. Now, we have information on the age at marriage for the censuses in the 1970s and 1980s. So this is something that is strongly correlated with the number of children that they will have in the when they finish their fertility cycle. But I think that we have other data, we have other survey data in which we have more information about the age when they married and the age when they had their first kid. So maybe using these additional data sets, we could look at it, because yeah. Another caveat of what we are doing that is good that you asked this is that we are having in the sample people who may not have had all the children they are going to have in the future, right? So we are having people in their late 20s, in their 30s, right? And they may still have some children, right? So a potential thing that we are finding is that they may not actually be shifting the number of children that much, but changing the timing. They have children and then they are having them earlier, for instance, or later. Right? So that relates to what you're saying, and I think we should really be clear about what we are finding and what other dimensions are affected.
Okay, and one last point, if I still have time. So I was wondering whether you have other differences between Java and Bali and the other islands, in the sense, for instance, of preference for sons, because in this case, something that is typically done to infer the preference for son is to look at the likelihood that the last born for couples with completed fertility is a son rather than a daughter, so a boy rather than a girl, and to see whether, again, you have some kind of transmission. But here I'm just guessing. I don't know whether there was any other stark difference beyond the number of children. So for instance, in terms of how many sons you desire, that might have, again, been transmitted.
Yeah, that's something that we haven't explored and that I know very little about. So it's very likely that there are strong differences in the patterns and in other cultural dimensions, because even within Java, there are like dozens of different ethnic groups speaking different languages, peoples who historically have been isolated from each other. So I would that are Lali and also with respect to the outer island. So yeah, we will try to see. So again, so we don't have we only see the children who are living in the household.
Correct. Okay, so you have a problem because those with completed fertility are going to have non-co-resident children. Sure.
Yeah, but yeah, I think we should know better about what are, especially, yeah. So we could actually compute maybe something like sex ratios or something like that to look at the place and in that way infer the places in which there could have been a stronger preference for children. given text, right? So maybe this would be more like more infant mortality rates by sex, right? So there's a potential avenues to explore this. So thank you.
No, you're welcome. Thanks for a great presentation.
Hi, Martin. Do I still have some time or should we close?
Yeah, I was just about to say that our time is up, but we will welcome 3 more questions. One is from Sulin, another one from Ubaid, who wrote it in the Q&A, and then Jesus raised his virtual hand. So for those who want to stay, please.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation, Martin. I have 2 remarks, one minor one and one a bit bigger. The first one is, I think for the identifying assumption, you would have to show not only that the distribution of migrants across destinations is orthogonal to average fertility norms there, but the path and the trends of fertility, right? So if you have differential distribution according to changes in the fertility rate, that would also impact your results. So maybe that would be a thing to show that would be a bit cleaner. Maybe you do it in the paper. And the other thing is, so you have a lot of heterogeneous results, and I haven't understood the story behind this or the narrative. What's your hypothetical, theoretical prior to why these things are happening? And could you sort of bring your results together and sort of the narrative that makes us explain why backlash happens and why it's differentially affecting different types of migrants? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is what we are currently at, right? To try to make sense of all these results. So let me just give you some thoughts on this. So what we have is that in most of the places, natives are like a big minority, so to speak, right? So there are like between like 10 to 50%, but they tend to be more homogeneous, right? While transmigrants, they are like split. They are coming from multiple different places, and they are a small part of that new society in those villages. So I think that this connects with the ideas of polarization and fractionalization, right? So I think that the fact that we observe a backlash among transmigrants is because they are a minority, and that is somehow pushing them to sort of like try to differentiate themselves or to preserve their culture or their way of living, right? So that's something that we are thinking, and that we are like looking onto to how to narrow down and explore in more detail. And now the questions of natives, right? So the people who are, the women who are marrying the transmigrants, this can be influenced by the fact, well, by aspects like that were discussed before, like the bargaining power of men and women, or the characteristics of these transmigrant men who are coming from Java Valley and marrying these native women. But yeah, we are a bit like trying to connect all the dots and to sort of like understand better what is the story that is taking place here. So yeah, and regarding your first point, you are absolutely right. And given that we have 2 censuses, the 71 and the 80, we can, of course, do the difference in the change in fertility patterns in this decade. So, I don't know if you have any, well, maybe we should discuss privately and move to the other questions, but I would be super interested in know what are your thoughts about what can be going on.
Yeah, pleasure.
Jesus, can you go ahead, please? I think you can speak.
Thanks, Luca. Hello, Martin. This is Jesus Fernandez Huertas. Nice to hear you give this great presentation. So I have a question about the level of clustering So in my view, your level of clustering is appropriate for one of the 3 fertility norms that you are trying to look at whose effect you are trying to look, which would be the fertility norm at the destination. But I wonder whether this is the appropriate level of clustering to look at the 2 other fertility norms, the transmigrants fertility norm and the fertility norm at the origin. And then a related point would be whether you have enough variation in the data as to be able to saturate the model with fixed effects at the levels, at 2 of the levels that you are not looking at, and look at the 3 fertility norms in separate. So what I mean is try to saturate the model with fixed effects at the origin level, at the village, at the transmigrants village level, and then try to exploit only the variation at the level of the natives fertility norm. I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself very well.
So
that would allow you to look at issues like what Simone was mentioning, like I mean, maybe it matters, the variance matters as much as the mean in terms of the origin, for example.
Yeah. So yeah, regarding the clustering, what we are doing in all the specifications is that we cluster at the level of the district, right? So we have everybody in different villages within district that seem to be related. But you are right in what you're saying, that we could do better, right? And we could do different clustering depending on the population of interest and the norm that we are considering. So yeah, so thank you for that suggestion. And we want to actually go even further and probably do some clustering related to spatial dimensions of these places, right? Because some of these villages are close to each other and so on. So we may do some other ways. And your second point about the fixed effects, so we have tried this, right? So we have tried, for instance, to include the origin fixed effects. So what happens here with the transmigrants is that most of the transmigrants coming from a given district in Java and Bali, they tend to move at the same place at the same time, right? And then as a consequence, they tend to end up in similar places, right? So that doesn't leave us so much variation to estimate the things. So we have done that. I think it's much less precise and less robust. But yeah, maybe we should think, how to do it properly, or how we can plan this. But yeah, that could help to disentangle some things. So thank you.
Thanks.
We have the only fixed effect that we are including as of now, because it's the one that allows us to have sufficient, is only the island fixed effect. So we are always looking at people within the same island, outer island in Java and Bali.
Okay, thank you.
So thanks, Martin, and thanks everybody for your question. Before everybody leaves, I just wanted to remind you all that we are having our next seminar next Monday and not in 2 weeks' time. So if you can unshare your screen for a second, Martin, I will give the details about the next presentation. And yeah, thanks everybody again for your questions. So the next presentation is going to be by Ismael Galvez Iniesta on the role of immigration in a deep recession. If you have further questions to Martin, please do not hesitate to email to him, and we will get you the conversation and all the Q&A, Martin. So thanks everybody for coming, and see you next Monday.